In this session, we're going to look at exception words, those words that do not have irregular spelling and sometimes are referred to as tricky, or in some programs, red words. Before we start considering the spelling patterns in English, however, we need to remind ourselves of the principles of phonics. Number one, that phonemes are represented by graphemes, that is to say letters, but that those letters can be in combination, so a phoneme can be represented by more than one letter. Also, that the same phoneme can be represented or spelled in more than one way, and that the same spelling may represent more than one phoneme. And these principles underpin everything that we're talking about in this session. Before we start looking at some of the complexity of irregular spelling in English, we need to make sure that we are clear about some definitions. So we will think about decoding, encoding, orthography, and what it means to have a regular spelling or an irregular spelling, and also the nature of decodable texts. We'll also consider what it means for a word to be tricky and question whether that use of that word is appropriate. First of all, decode. Decoding can be thought of as using the sounds associated with the letters to pronounce or work out the pronunciation of a word. And according to the national curriculum, the speedy working out of the pronunciation of unfamiliar printed words, the link between print to sound. So as in the diagram at the bottom, you are going from written word, and decoding leads you to a spoken word that can be articulated through the voice and or can be thought of in the head. Encoding, we are working the other way round. So we are going from the spoken word through encoding to the written word. So encoding means spelling. So we're starting with the pronunciation of the word, sat, and working out which graphemes are needed, which letters are needed to represent, when we write down the word sat, to represent each of the phonemes, the s, a, t. Orthography simply means the spelling conventions of a language, and regular is the relationship between letters and their pronunciation when it follows the spelling conventions, when it follows regular orthography. So irregular is the relationship between phonemes and graphemes when it doesn't follow, when they don't follow the language's spelling conventions, when they don't follow a language's regular orthography. So irregular words are sometimes referred to as exception and occasionally strange words. Exception words have patterns that are quite familiar. So if you look at the second example here, you have got a split digraph of A and E, but it's pronounced a rather than have. And if you read down the definition, but their pronunciation differs to most of the words that have similar spellings. For example, pint does not rhyme with tint, hint, splint, and have, as I've said, does not rhyme with gave, slave, wave. Words like yacht, gauge, and isle have unique spellings. They are not fully decodable. They have some letter sound information that corresponds, because I said, if you remember when we looked at yacht, that the y was represented by y, as we would expect. The t was represented by t, as we should expect. But according to the national curriculum, we should not teach these purely as sight words, and we'll come on to that point again in a moment. So what is a tricky word? Well, to start off with, tricky is the term used by letters and sounds to describe words that are irregular. So words are tricky when they have an irregular orthography. So common exception words like of, the, they are tricky. And for a child, any word is tricky until they know how to spell it. So if they only know the simple code for grapheme phoneme correspondences and not the more complex code, then there are going to be many words that are tricky for them at that point. But once they learn the more complex code, those words will cease to be tricky. Decodable texts only use words that children are able to decode at the stage at which they are in their phonic development. So an example here, The Odd Pet by Julia Donaldson, is when children are first learning grapheme phoneme correspondences. So if you look where it says this book practices these sounds, and they are the sounds for S, M, C, T, G, P, etc. But they are only the sort of the very early stages where their children only have one grapheme phoneme correspondence to think about. So for S they only know S, for M, M, for C, K, for T, T, etc. Also, the children need to know those words at the bottom, which are defined as tricky, have now of the. If children are able to make those links between phoneme and grapheme for all of those letters and know those tricky words, they are able to read this text and, importantly, gain meaning from it, remembering that reading comprehension is the aim of reading. So let's start by looking at a simple CVC word. Sat. Now, in order to spell sat, we need to segment it so that we can then encode it. So we segment s, a, t. So our first phoneme is s, our second phoneme is a, our third phoneme is t. When we want to encode, we need to know what the grapheme phoneme correspondences are for these phonemes, and they are S, A, T. The S corresponds to the S sound, the A to the A sound, the T to the T sound. So this is a regular spelling. It is decodable. For a child who was reading the Odd Pet, they could read this word. But now let's think of another CVC word, said. Said. And if we segment it, S, E, D, we get S, E, D, three phonemes. Three phonemes will have three graphemes that correspond to them. But in this case, we have the S gives the S sound, and the D gives the D sound at the end. But in the middle, the E sound is encoded using AI. So a child who is only at the stage of being able to read the Odd Pet could not decode this. So this is a tricky word for that child. More complex, when we get to words where the English language becomes fairly unpredictable, another CVC word is yacht. Y-O-T. Again, we have three phonemes. To encode, we will need three graphemes. Now, the initial consonant sound, the Y, we will spell with a Y. That final T sound we will spell with a T. But if you look at the medial vowel sound, the O, that is spelled A-C-H. It is encoded using A-C-H. So this is not predictable. This is not a regular decodable word. This is a tricky word. It's actually what we have defined as a strange word. Here are a list of 100 high-frequency words. This is from phase 2 in letters and sounds. High-frequency words are discovered by people doing surveys of children's literature and finding out which words are used most commonly. And in the back of letters and sounds guidance, you will find lists of tricky words, high-frequency words for each of the phases, where they have separated it into, as you can see, decodable words and tricky words. So that sounds terribly straightforward, and I'm sure you can feel there's a but coming in here. And there is. So let's look at this list of decodable words. Here I have highlighted a, as, of, his, and put. Now we'll come on to the put one last, because that needs some further explaining. But not all schemes agree which are decodable words. For instance, here you are, Jolly Phonics readers read words, so those words that are considered to be tricky includes of, whereas in letters and sounds it's considered decodable. So let's look at the word of and see why Jolly Phonics would consider it a tricky word. So here we have two letters O, F, and they give us two phonemes. O is O, which is regular, but the F, which we would expect to be F, is actually V, of. it's vocalized, which is why it's in the tricky words for Jolly Phonics, because actually that's not the simple code. The simple code would be have the F as a F sound. You may remember that of was one of the tricky words listed for Julia Donaldson's decodable book, The Odd Pet. And the odd pet is at an equivalent phonics level of phase 3 for letters and sounds, and of is considered by letters and sounds to be decodable at phase 2. So you can see there is a slight discrepancy here between the different phonics schemes and programs. What about the simplest of all words? Now, if I wanted to be emphatic as I was holding up an object, I might say a book, a book. So this one grapheme, single letter grapheme here, has a corresponding phoneme of a, not a. Now you might say, yes, but sometimes you say a book. There might be a few people who say a book, but most people, I suspect, don't say a book, they say a book, which is the schwa sound. It is not the simple code of the letter A being a. Here is another word from that list, as, as. Now we have as, but if we orally segment the word as, we have a, z. So the letter S, the grapheme S, corresponds to the z sound, not the s sound, which will be the sound that children first learn to associate with that letter. So let's try another word, his. And if we orally segment that, we get h, I, z. Once more, you see that the S becomes, it corresponds to the z sound, not the s sound. So it's all very well saying that schemes disagree over which words are tricky and which words are not. So what do you do as a teacher? As a teacher, you are listening to the difficulties that children have. So if a child wants to spell the word his, whether or not it's counted as a tricky word in your scheme, you should be listening to the sounds that they are making and the associations that they are making in terms of grapheme phoneme correspondences, and aiding them with that. And if they write H-I-Z, then you need to be able to support them and explain to them that sometimes the S is sounded as a Z sound, as in as and his. So it's about sensitivity to the child's needs and the child's perceptions of spelling and pronunciation. The question of regularity of spelling is, however, sometimes linked to accent. So if we look at a word that follows the simple code, which is the word cut, we have the letter C-U-T, which give us the corresponding phonemes of k, a, t. However, if I put the word put up, we have the phoneme at the beginning is p, as is a regular simple code, and at the end t, but the medial vowel, the middle vowel, is not a, it is u. So we have cut and put. So put is not a regular spelling, it's an exception. However, if we are in the north of England, the word cut, the word that I pronounce as cut, would not be pronounced as cut, it would be pronounced as cut. So that the word put follows exactly the same pattern. So if you're in the north of England, this is not tricky, this is not difficult. The word put follows exactly the same pronunciation pattern as the word cut. So you have to be aware of the language that children use, the language that you use, and be sensitive to different accents and how people say words, because that affects how they spell, because we are moving from sound to text when we spell, and from text to sound or imagining sound when we read. Now the national curriculum is quite clear that the overarching principle is that letters on the page represent sounds in spoken words, and that should underpin reading and spelling for all words, which includes those with unusual grapheme phoneme correspondences. And it's that statement that means that we have to, even when we're facing a word like yacht, we should still be talking to children about the sounds that they are hearing and the parts of the words that are regular. So you've got the y and the t, and said, s and d. And the letters that go with s and d are s and d. It's just the e bit that needs the ai. In yacht, it's the o bit that is irregular. The y, t are regular and have regular spellings. Finally, there's a question about should we refer to words as tricky? Is there any problem referring to words as tricky or indeed red? And some people would suggest that actually if you say that a word is tricky, what you're actually doing is setting up a barrier. So maybe using the word irregular would be better. However, the word tricky and the word red are both embedded into different schemes, so that will be the expectation most of the time. But just be aware of the potential that those words could have in setting up barriers to children's learning.